camera?
Sure. I'm John Englander. I'm an oceanographer and author of a book called High Tide on Main Street, Rising Sea Level and the Coming Coastal Crisis. And I'm here as part of a panel at Globe 2014 talking about the effects on the urban environment of sea level rise. The important thing with sea level rise is to get in sense a longer time perspective, because it hasn't changed much in thousands of years, and we tend to assume it's not going to change much, but we know it is because the ice is melting. And the dynamics and magnitude of these changes are really quite daunting. And when we plan our cities of the future and how we adapt our current cities more realistically, we need to consider what's going to happen. And we're going to get several feet or meters of sea level rise eventually, whether it's this century or next, and we need to start thinking ahead. Well, Vancouver is a delta city with the big river, the Fraser, coming in here. Of course, just south of the city has a lot of typical vulnerabilities of a delta area. Compacting silts, the areas from the airport and south are slightly depressing, which is very common in delta areas. Vancouver is aware of it. They've talked about some plans, some fairly significant plans over the course of this century to begin to deal with it. But I would say Vancouver is kind of in the middle. It's not as vulnerable as Miami, near where I live, and it's, of course, more vulnerable as a delta area than perhaps some more stable geologic regions. It could affect everything from utilities, how our wastewater treatment plants work, how our water processing plants, our utilities, distribution could be underwater in some places. Homes, there's already places down in Delta, BC, where at full moon high tide, the streets are awash. It comes over the bulkhead. And that's not just here. It happens from all over the world, actually, that these king tides, which is when the tides are at their peak, are kind of showing us what's going to happen with a routine high tide and eventually with a low tide as the sea gets higher and higher. And so it means redesigning, changing our elevation levels, our building codes. It's starting to happen here. Fortunately, Vancouver, again, is on the forefront, not only on carbon and issues like that, but even in North Vancouver, a recent development required that they build it up 3 feet or a meter. And that's really very advanced thinking. That's great to see. The question of mitigation versus adaptation is really an important one. And much of the world is looking at the mitigation, or how do we slow the warming at the moment, which is certainly valid. But there's almost an implication that if we get the mitigation right, we won't have to adapt. And sea level proves the fallacy of that. Because even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, if we kept it at around 400 parts per million, the current level of CO2, sea level will rise for centuries because the ocean is at a higher heat level and the ice sheets will get smaller. So we need to do two things in parallel. We need to begin adapting to changing climate, and particularly rising sea level, because it's now unstoppable. And once we recognize the cost of that and the magnitude of that, it will hopefully persuade us to put more efforts into mitigation as well. But we can't do mitigation first, hoping adaptation won't be necessary. The best time frame to look at sea level rise is probably 30 years. And I picked that because 3 decades is a period of time in which we can see some actual change in sea level, even though already we're seeing these king tides, kind of an advanced warning of what can happen. But when you look out 30 years, that's a period of time of amortizing most buildings and major infrastructure. A lot of financing in the corporate world is done over 30 years. And so it's a good time frame. And in the corporate environment, people get to plan ahead strategically because they have to think about their long-term facility siting or for growth and vulnerability and risk. And I think that corporations have a really important role because they tend to think longer term than the typical individual and have the resources, and particularly the bigger corporations. So I really enjoy talking to big corporations and also national security and military institutions because they tend to think strategically and longer term. Most of us tend to think shorter term in our own lives. What are we going to do next year is the long term for most people. So I like the corporate environment, and I think they can make good strategic choices and lead the way. part of the challenge is our time frame again, and since our civilization goes back a few thousand years, but America a few hundred years is our typical reference point, we tend not to see these changes in sea level and how this whole thing has come about. But interestingly, off the coast of British Columbia here, the island of Haida Gwaii, formerly the Queen Charlotte Islands, of course, is a place where they've been living for 13 or 14,000 years. And it's one of the few places in North America that there's been a continuous civilization. And they actually go back to the time when the sea level rose back 14,000 years ago, when it rose about, let's see, it was 65 feet, so it's at 20 meters in a period of 4 centuries. And they actually have tales of that in their oral traditions still today. In terms of scale, sea level moves up and down about 120 meters with each of the normal ice ages. But we're at the top part of that normal cycle. And for several million years, we've been in this range of the amount of ice we have today, or a lot more ice during the height of the ice age, like 20,000 years ago. When all the remaining ice on the planet melts, what's in Greenland, Antarctica, and the little bit in glaciers, sea level will be 65 meters higher. The one other point that's useful to think about, that there are a lot of different reasons why a particular piece of land, particularly on the coast, goes underwater. It can be a storm surge, it can be an extreme tide, a king tide, it can be runoff from extreme rainfall that happens upstream, or happens in places like Seattle recently, and happened in Calgary, of course, a few years ago. But sea level rise, which heightens all of that and lifts everything up higher, just goes inch by inch or centimeter by centimeter and doesn't go down. And it can't go down for a long, long time. And therefore, it deserves to be thought of a little bit separately. You don't see it because it's so slow, but it's like the tortoise that wins the race. It's just going to get creepingly higher while the other things come in and recede and you can rebuild. But as sea level rises, not to go down for many, many centuries, because the ice sheets can't get back to growing until we cool the ocean. This is my first Globe Conference, 2014. I'm sure it won't be my last. It's amazing to see several thousand people from around the world with very diverse backgrounds and interests come to one place, and a fantastic city to boot, Vancouver, but regardless, to talk about all these different aspects of mitigation, sustainability, adaptation, culturally, socially, scientifically. It's really a fabulous conference. I've done a lot of events in the last couple of years since my book's been out, but I've never been to anything like this, and it's really great.